He found the note on a Saturday morning, stuck under the coffee maker with a magnet shaped like a smiling sun. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant, rushed, and full of something he couldn't name until much later. "I'm sorry. I just can't do this anymore." 7 words. That's all Alicia left behind when she walked out of their home, their marriage, and their 5 children. Darius stood there for a full minute, the smell of burnt toast in the air, the baby monitor still hissing softly from the counter. He didn't blink. He didn't yell. His heart thudded once, hard, then settled into a strange, unnatural calm. Upstairs, footsteps. Illa was awake, and soon the rest would follow. Saturday mornings used to be sacred in the Miller household. Pajamas till noon, cartoons blaring, pancake batter on the ceiling. He stared at the note again. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a white square of paper, and the silence of a house that suddenly felt too big. He folded it twice and tucked it in the back pocket of his jeans, when Illa ran into the kitchen rubbing her eyes and asked, "Where's Mommy?" Darius knelt beside her and kissed the top of her head. "She just stepped out, sweetheart," he said. "She'll be back soon." He lied, but not because he wanted to protect Alicia. He lied because in that moment she wasn't the one who needed protecting. It was them. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first 3 days were a blur of cereal for dinner, mismatched socks, and questions he couldn't answer. Did Mommy forget about us? When is she coming back? Is it because Jaden broke the vase? Darius answered with hugs and bedtime stories, with pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and extra-long piggyback rides. But after the 3rd night, when Illa had cried herself to sleep clinging to her mother's old scarf, something in him cracked. He sat on the floor of the laundry room, the only place in the house where no one bothered him, and let himself fall apart, quietly, behind the hum of the dryer. His tears didn't come with rage. They came with the terrifying realization that this wasn't temporary. She wasn't coming back. The next morning he called his boss and said the words no man like him ever planned to say. "I need to cut back. I can't work nights anymore. I've got the kids." There was silence on the other end, followed by a gruff exhale. Then, "Darius, you're one of the best guys I've got. I'll do what I can." By the end of the week, he had dropped one of his 2 jobs. It meant less money. It meant tighter months, and goodbye to the emergency savings. But it also meant Illa would get to kindergarten on time. It meant Micah wouldn't have to heat up frozen dinners every night. It meant Darius could show up, and showing up became everything. He learned how to braid hair from a YouTube video at midnight. He bought meal prep containers and wrote out checklists with stickers for every chore. He found little ways to make things feel normal. Sunday movie nights, messy Taco Tuesdays, and giving each kid their own special mug for hot chocolate. They weren't big things, but they were enough to stitch the days together. And every night, after brushing 4 sets of teeth and tucking 5 heads into 5 beds, he'd sit by the window with his chipped coffee mug and stare at the porch. Light. He left it on for Alicia. Not because he hoped she'd come back, but because deep down, he needed to believe he'd done everything, absolutely everything, to make it easy for her to choose them again, even when he knew she wouldn't. By year 2, Darius had stopped looking at the porch light. It still turned on every evening at 7, like clockwork, but it had become just another part of the routine, like packing school lunches or fixing the bathroom sink with duct tape and determination. Micah was now 15, tall and quiet, with a stare that could cut through excuses. He'd taken on the silent role of second in command. He helped the younger ones with homework, picked up dry cleaning when Darius forgot, and made sure Illa's lunch never lacked the extra apple slices she loved. Jaden was the loud one. Funny, sarcastic, a little too sharp for his own good. He'd mastered making pancakes better than his dad, and had opinions about everything from school rules to superhero movies. Illa was sensitive, still slept with the same threadbare stuffed rabbit every night, and had started drawing pictures of families with a blank space where the mom should be. And the twins, well, they were hurricanes. Pure energy and noise and love. Darius used to joke that raising them was like trying to bathe two raccoons at the same time. Somehow, they made it work. He budgeted like a madman. Every bonus check went to shoes that fit or braces that couldn't wait. There were no vacations, no date nights, no new clothes unless something had holes. But there was laughter and warmth and a house that, despite the chaos, felt like home. Every so often, someone at church or the grocery store would pull Darius aside and whisper, "I don't know how you do it. 5 kids, alone. You're incredible." But he never knew what to say, because he didn't feel incredible. He felt tired. He'd lie awake some nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was enough. If the kids would grow up remembering bedtime stories, or just the nights he came home late and forgot to ask about their day. But every morning he got up. He made the oatmeal. He signed the permission slips. He braided Illa's hair and double-checked lunch boxes and wrestled the twins into their shoes. And somewhere along the way, in the middle of all that tiredness, something quietly bloomed inside him. It wasn't confidence, it was clarity. He wasn't just surviving. He was building something, stronger than what she left behind, deeper than the promises she broke. He was building a family, brick by brick, with hands that never stopped shaking but never stopped working. And that was enough. The letter came on a Tuesday. Not a birthday, not a holiday, just Tuesday. It was stuffed into the mailbox between a grocery store coupon flyer and a late notice from the power company. Darius almost didn't see it. But something about the handwriting stopped him cold. His breath caught. It was her. 10 years. No calls, no emails, no birthdays, no, "I miss you." No, "I'm sorry." And now, this. He didn't open it right away. Just stood in the kitchen, the envelope in one hand, a half-sliced apple in the other, the kids arguing in the background over who had the last toaster waffle. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket and went back to slicing apples like his chest wasn't pounding. That night, once the house was quiet and everyone was finally asleep, he pulled it out again. The envelope was creased and worn, like it had been carried around a while. Her name wasn't on it. No return address. Just his name. Just Darius. He sat at the edge of his bed and opened it with hands that suddenly felt foreign. Her handwriting hadn't changed. "Dear Darius," it began. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. And you're right. I don't deserve to ask anything of you. But please, let me say this." She said she'd left because she couldn't breathe. That every day felt like she was slowly disappearing into laundry, dishes, screaming toddlers, and the crushing weight of being needed. She said she broke, and once she broke, she didn't know how to come back without shattering everything else. She wrote about the years after. Therapy, failures, lonely Christmases. She said she thought about the kids every day, that she hadn't sent birthday cards because she thought they'd be returned, that she was scared to know if they hated her. Then came the last line. "I want to see them. Even once, just once. I know it's selfish, But if there's even a chance, please let me try. I'm not who I was." Darius sat in the dark for a long time, letter resting in his lap, her words circling him like a ghost he'd learned to live without. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He didn't know what he felt. Because 10 years is a long time. Long enough to grieve, long enough to rebuild, but maybe not long enough to forget, and definitely not long enough to trust. The letter stayed on the kitchen counter for 3 days. He didn't hide it, didn't lock it away. He just left it there, beneath the fruit bowl, half covered by a grocery list Micah had scribbled on a napkin. It was like a quiet presence in the house, something unsaid but deeply felt. The kids noticed, of course. Micah was the first to speak. "Is that from her?" he asked one evening while rinsing dishes, eyes flicking toward the envelope like it might bite him. Darius nodded. "Yeah, it is." Micah didn't say anything else, just went back to washing the plates, jaw clenched so tight Darius could hear it over the running water. Later that night, Jaden picked up the envelope and turned it over in his hands. "Does she want to come back?" Darius hesitated. "She says she wants to see you. All of you." Illa overheard. She froze at the kitchen doorway, her tiny frame suddenly so still it made Darius's heart ache. "Does she miss us?" she whispered. And Darius, a man who'd carried every broken piece of their world for 10 years, didn't know how to answer. Because how do you measure absence? How do you explain a mother's silence to a child who still waits for bedtime kisses? "She says she does," he replied softly. "But that doesn't mean we have to see her. That's up to you." The house felt heavier that night. Micah stayed up late scrolling his phone. The next morning he came into the kitchen holding it out. I found her. Her profile was private, but the bio was public. Healing, recovering, trying again. There were posts, some vague, some desperate, a few crowdfunding links, a GoFundMe campaign titled "Restarting After Hitting Rock Bottom." Darius read, in silence. Micah was staring at him hard. "She didn't come back because of us, Dad. She came back because she's drowning, and she thinks we're the life raft." Jaden, quiet as ever, added, "She doesn't even know what we look like anymore." Darius felt something shift in the air. A truth no one wanted to say out loud had finally settled between them. And yet, he didn't rush to judgment. Instead, he said, "Then we find out the truth. All of it. No more guessing, no more shadows." Because he hadn't spent 10 years holding a family together with duct tape and midnight prayers just to let it fall apart now. Not without knowing everything. First. Darius sat in his truck that night, engine off, staring at the quiet street outside his house. The glow from the porch light spilled across the front steps where Illa had left her tiny sneakers. Jaden's basketball leaned against the porch railing. A decade of echoes lived in that yard. Laughter, scraped knees, water balloon fights. First, bike rides. He made the call. The man on the other end had a calm, clipped voice. Professional. Discreet. "I just need the truth," Darius said. "No more, no less." He hired a private investigator, not out of spite or revenge, but because his kids deserved clarity. So did he. 2 days later, Alicia called. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice wasn't. "Darius?" "It's me." Silence. "I wrote you. Did you get it?" "I did." "I meant every word," she said, voice trembling. "I've changed. I've been in therapy. I know what I did. What I left behind." He didn't respond. "I'm not asking to come back," she added quickly. I want to see them. One visit, just one." He closed his eyes. "I'll ask them." he said. But if they say no, then it ends there. No surprises. No showing up. You don't get to shake their world again unless they invite you in. I understand, she whispered. They met in a park the following Saturday. Alicia sat alone on a bench under a leafless tree, bundled in a worn coat too thin for the weather. She looked older than her years, pale, tired, nervous. In her hands, she clutched a reusable coffee cup like a lifeline. The kids stood beside Darius, lined up by age almost instinctively. Micah tall and guarded, arms folded. Jaden with his shoulders tight. Illa gripping Darius's hand, half hidden behind his leg. Alicia stood when she saw them. Her eyes welled with tears. "Illa!" she breathed, taking a step forward. Illa took a step back. Darius didn't move. Alicia stopped. "I'm sorry. For everything. I was lost. Micah's voice cut through the cold. "What do you want?" She blinked. I want to be a part of your lives again, if you'll let me." Micah shook his head. "We don't know you." "I know," she said. "I just hoped." He didn't wait for her to finish. Jaden looked down, then up. "You hurt him," he said quietly. "You broke him. We had to put him back together." Alicia's lips trembled. "Illa," she whispered again. The little girl's voice was steady, too steady for a 10-year-old. "I needed you, and you didn't come." Alicia's face crumpled. Darius stepped forward then, not to comfort her, but to stand between her and the children. "That's enough for today," she nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. "I'm sorry." Darius didn't respond. He turned and the kids followed, wordless, back to the truck. No one said much on the ride home, but when they pulled into the driveway, Illa reached forward, from the back seat, and wrapped her arms around Darius's shoulders. "Thank you for not leaving," she whispered. And in that moment, Darius knew he'd already made the right decision. The report from the private investigator arrived in a slim envelope 3 days later. Darius waited until the kids were asleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd filled lunchboxes, reviewed math homework, signed permission slips. The same spot where, 10 years ago, he'd sat with a cup of cold coffee wondering how to tell his children their mother wasn't coming back. He opened the envelope. It was all there, more than he expected, and exactly what he feared. Alicia had spiraled after leaving. There were traces of 3 failed businesses, mounting credit card debt, eviction notices, and a string of addresses in 4 different states. She had listed herself on a GoFundMe campaign with a desperate plea. "Help me rebuild after rock bottom." The investigator had even included screenshots of her posts on parenting forums, where she blamed Darius for everything, claiming he'd refused to co-parent, alienated her from the kids, and cut her off financially. Darius folded the papers, slowly, not in anger, just sadness, because the truth didn't make it easier. It just made it final. He called a family meeting the next evening. Micah sat at the head of the table now, out of habit more than anything. Jaden to his right, Illa in Darius's lap. The twins were drawing on placemats nearby, half listening. "I want you all to hear something," Darius began, laying the file on the table. "These are the facts. Nothing hidden. I promised we'd never lie to each other." He explained the contents in plain, gentle words. He didn't embellish or soften what Alicia had said about them, or about him. He didn't raise his voice. He just told the truth. When he finished, the room was quiet. Illa whispered, "So, she didn't come back because she missed us." "No, sweetheart." Darius said softly. "She came back because she was in trouble." Micah leaned forward, his jaw tight. "We were just a chapter she wanted to reopen, because her life fell apart." Jaden said nothing, but his eyes said enough. Then, without a word, Darius stood up, walked over to the side cabinet, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He returned to the table and placed it in the center. "What's that?" Jaden asked. Darius looked at each of them, one by one. "It's the adoption paperwork," he said. "Finalized 3 years ago." Micah blinked. "Wait, what?" "I adopted all 5 of you," Darius said. "Legally, fully. No loopholes, no custody battles. No one can take you away from me." The silence that followed was heavy, and then it cracked. Illa started to cry first, soft, hiccuping sobs that made Jaden reach over and hug her tight. Micah looked away, blinking fast. "You did all of that, and never said anything?" Micah's voice broke. Darius smiled. "Because love doesn't always make announcements, son. Sometimes it just signs the papers, keeps the lights on, and picks you up from soccer practice." Micah nodded, then stood and walked around the table. He wrapped his arms around his father's shoulders and held on for a long, long time. And in that moment, the past didn't matter as much, because they all knew, no matter what Alicia had done or why she had returned, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were a family, a real one, built not on promises or bloodlines, but on effort, on loyalty, on love that showed up every single day. 2 weeks later, a final letter arrived, this time with no return address and no plea, just an apology. Alicia's handwriting looked smaller than before, shakier. She wrote that she understood now, that she had made choices she couldn't undo, and that the children deserved peace. She said she wouldn't contact them again unless they reached out first. She had found a job in another state, was living in a women's shelter, and was starting over. This time alone. Darius didn't read the letter out loud. He placed it in a drawer in the kitchen marked "Important Papers," between insurance files and expired coupons. Some things were worth keeping, not for what they were, but for what they represented. Closure. Life began to settle again. The twins started calling Darius Dad more naturally now, without hesitation. Jaden built a birdhouse in shop class and painted it blue, just like the house they had grown up in. Illa danced through the living room in mismatched socks and glittery wings, asking if she could be a butterfly when she grows up. Darius told her, "You already are." Micah got into college. Not a fancy one, not a full scholarship, but one he wanted, one he chose. And when the acceptance letter came, Darius pulled him into a tight hug and said, "You earned every bit of this." And that night, Darius sat outside on the porch, feet up, coffee in hand, watching the sun dip below the trees. The old mug was still chipped, the one Alicia had once bought for his birthday. But the memory no longer stung. It had softened. The pain had settled into something else, something quieter. Not forgiveness, maybe, but peace, because he had done it, not alone, but together with his children. He hadn't just raised 5 kids. He had raised warriors, gentle ones, resilient ones. Kids who didn't grow up perfect, but who grew up loved. And when Ela came out, curled into his lap and whispered, "Do you think Mommy will ever come back again?" Darius thought for a moment, then kissed the top of her head. "I think," he said, "that she already had her chance." They sat there like that until the stars blinked awake overhead. No more letters, no more questions, just the quiet, steady beat of a life rebuilt, stronger, fuller, and finally whole. The 1-year mark passed quietly, without drama, without letters, without apologies. No one mentioned it, but they all knew. That same week, Micah packed his bags for college. Darius drove him to campus in the old truck that had survived 5 kids, a decade of single fatherhood, and more McDonald's wrappers than he cared to count. They didn't talk much on the way. They didn't need to. At the dorm room, Darius helped lift the final box onto the bed. Micah turned, gave him a look that was part pride, part sadness, and said, "You sure you're gonna be okay without your sidekick?" Darius chuckled, then pulled him in. "You were never the sidekick. You were the co-pilot." The hug lasted longer than either of them expected, and when they pulled away, Darius pressed a folded envelope into Micah's hand. "What's this?" Micah asked. "Something you might need one day. Or maybe not. Either way, it's yours." Micah nodded, slid it into his backpack without opening it, and gave one last smile before heading into the building. Back home, things shifted. Jaden took up more responsibility without being asked. Illa began writing in a journal she wouldn't let anyone read. The twins started calling Darius Pops instead of Dad, thinking it made them sound cooler. It didn't, but he let it slide. The house was still loud, still messy, but it was theirs, completely theirs. Late one evening, Darius stood in the hallway, staring at a wall filled with photographs, some taken on birthdays, some on school steps, some blurry with laughter mid-frame. No professional shots, just moments, real ones, and then his eyes landed on the only photo left of Alicia, a younger version, smiling at the camera, holding baby Jaden. Darius didn't feel angry anymore, just distant, like she belonged to a different story, a different man. He reached up, pulled the photo down, and placed it in a box, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The past no longer belonged on the wall. The present had earned that space. And when he picked up the camera Micah had bought him for Father's Day, Darius did something he hadn't done in years. He took a picture of Illa asleep on the couch with a book across her chest, of the twins building a pillow fort in the living room, of Jaden bent over a puzzle, tongue between his teeth in concentration. He was capturing the now, the family that stayed, the life they built, the legacy he chose. Darius sat in his truck long after the meeting at the park had ended. The kids were already inside the house, back to their usual rhythms. Micah finishing homework, Jaden playing soft music upstairs, Illa curled up with a book on the couch. He stayed there for nearly an hour, engine off, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the distant hum of neighborhood life. His hands rested on the steering wheel, not clenched, not trembling, just still. For the first time in years, still. He wasn't angry. He wasn't grieving anymore. What he felt was harder to name but easier to carry. A kind of settled peace that comes only after the storm passes and you realize you didn't break. You bent, you burned, you bled. But you didn't break. That night he didn't mention the meeting to the kids. Neither did they. The silence wasn't avoidance. It was understanding, the kind that forms between people who've walked through fire and come out on the other side holding each other's hands. At dinner, Illa asked if they could have pancakes for dinner tomorrow. Jaden rolled his eyes and said only if they were his banana chocolate chip recipe. Micah, tired but light-hearted, asked if someone could remind him what a normal family dinner looked like, because he wasn't sure they'd ever had one. And Darius laughed. A real full laugh, not forced, not for their sake, but because, in that moment, surrounded by the chaos and comfort of the family he had kept whole, he realized something he hadn't dared to admit until now. They didn't need to go back to what they once were. They had become something new. And maybe, just maybe, something better. It was a Saturday morning when the final letter arrived. No return address, just his name, Darius Miller, written in handwriting he'd memorized once upon a time. Alicia's. The envelope was heavier than it looked, not from paper, but from something else. Something he couldn't quite define. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he made coffee, walked out onto the porch, and let the spring air move through him. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't wondering when she'd come back, why she left, or what he could have done differently. He was just breathing. Finally, he unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. Alicia wrote that she understood now, that time had shown her things she hadn't been willing to see before, that she'd watched from afar, photos Micah had posted of his college acceptance, videos Illa had shared of birthday cakes and dance recitals, and realized she was a guest in a life she abandoned. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask to come back. Instead, she thanked him for stepping in, for protecting them, for doing the thing she couldn't. And in the last line, she wrote, "Tell them I was wrong, and tell them I hope they never question how deeply they are loved, not by me, but by the man who never walked away, Darius." Folded the letter slowly, pressed it flat between his palms, and slid it into the drawer next to the adoption papers. Later that day, when the kids were outside playing soccer in the yard, he joined them, shoes off, laughter loud, chasing Illa around the grass like they were both 6 years old again, because this life, this noise, this ordinary magic, it was his now, and no letter, no past, no goodbye could ever take it away. The years didn't rush. They passed like slow-moving clouds, one after another, full of quiet growth, ordinary, chaos, and the kind of healing that doesn't make noise. Micah graduated college with honors. Jaden got her braces off and started volunteering at the local animal shelter. Illa? She became the fiercest little soccer player in town, always wearing the number 5. One for each year she'd waited for a hug that never came. And Darius, he kept showing up, every morning, every bedtime, every "Dad, can you help?" moment. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table. Just them, like always. Illa looked up with that steady little voice of hers and asked, "Do you think love gets tired?" Darius smiled. "No," he said softly. "Real love doesn't get tired. It grows roots, deep ones, the kind that hold you up when everything else falls apart." And in that moment, they all understood that love hadn't left them when their mother walked away. It had stayed in burnt pancakes and folded laundry, in emergency room visits and surprise birthday cakes. In the silence of 2 a.m. when only one person was still awake, watching over all the others. Love had a name, and for them, it was Darius. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story reminded you of someone who's carried more than their share it with them. Let them know you see their strength. And before you go, tell us, what does love look like to you when it's quiet? Leave us a comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because next time I've got something even more powerful coming your way. We'll see you there.